So we usually just see it as the larger structure of many thousands of millions of pieces together in a clod. But if we are to magnify it, put it under the microscope, you'll see all the fine microscopic pieces that make each individual particle or groups of particles. And when we run a tiller through it, especially, we're breaking that structure up. That's sometimes when you see those tiller ads, especially the Mantis, where that soil is nice and fluffy flying, you are destroying soil structure. And that there's some downside to that, even though it looks beautiful. And the tiller companies are going to advertise that. So it's going to be a mindset change. So we got to wrap our minds around that change. When we break up the soil structure, we break down the bacteria population that naturally exists in a soil. And if we leave the soil alone, it has its own set of bacteria colonies that are thriving and working and interacting with each other, breaking down organic matter and changing the pH of the soil and how your nutrients works. You also have a reduced earthworm population because you have something coming in and breaking everything up. Earthworms are nature's bulldozers, as we call them, nature's tillers, because they are going through, they're working through the soil, and I will show you the diagram in our handout of how they move. We have different types of earthworm species that have different functions. So we'll talk about that a little bit. The soil pH is slightly altered when we break that up too. So we're breaking up the bacteria, but when we do that, also slightly changes the pH. So that's different. And till soils tend to have a lower bacterial count because we're not allowing the soil to buffer itself and for the moisture to be there, because there's moisture loss every time we till. And there's also a temperature difference because soil in the ground it's a buffering state. So a no-tilled garden is going to have a cooler temperature, soil temperature, that will rise up slowly compared to a conventional tilled garden. Conventional tilled gardens will warm up quicker. So here is a picture of a conventional garden. This is from a University of Georgia publication that has lots of great information on it. So I encourage you to copy and paste that link on the bottom of the slide, throw it in your Google bar, hit enter, and then you'll get a whole extension publication. So I've embedded a bunch of publications in this one. You noticed in this case of this garden that they do look like they have some type of rotation and that they do have drip irrigation in here, but that soil is bare and the soil will warm up. Now, we also notice in this case, there's a fair amount of shade here, and shade impacts our ability to grow a lot of our vegetables, especially the tomatoes that are under shade right now. In this picture, our ideal is 8 hours of full sun for tomatoes to really thrive and not the plant just not stretch all over the place. If you look at some of our, looks like cole crops, meaning broccoli or cauliflower, young plants, or kohlrabi, you can see the stems are kind of stretched in here a little bit. That's because of the lack of light. But they can handle shade better than the tomatoes can. But this is an embedded publication for you to look at and check out. So I use a lot of different resources for you to look at and review. So no-till in general allows a soil structure to build up over time, where we are adding amendments, we're adding organic matter, we're adding carbon sources. Our carbon sources are going to be our brown material. Our browns are the leaves, the hay, the sawdust, the chicken litter out of the chicken house. Those are the carbon sources that will be part of that. And then we have our green material. Our green material are our kitchen scraps and the coffee grounds and goodies like that we're going to, and grass clippings. Now, there is a rule on grass clippings. If you have put a pesticide on the grass, do not use those in a vegetable garden. You can use grass clippings for that in your flower bed, because we do not know what was applied or the risk of that being absorbed into an edible portion of a garden crop or a vegetable or an herb. So that's one thing to think of, because people will ask me about the grass clippings. The old adage used to be, once you applied a herbicide, weed killer, or a fungicide on the lawn, you mowed it 3 times before you could ever use those grass clippings. That recommendation now has changed, where if you put on a weed killer or an insect killer or a fungicide, don't put it in the vegetable garden. So I wanted to bring that up right away. When we allow no-till to go, it builds those beneficial soil, fungi, and bacteria populations up. Fungi are digesters, so they're going to digest and break down the soil and make it more mellow, as what my parents would call that. We had a mellow garden spot. There is another term, it's called tilth, Tilth, where it's more workable. It's not so harsh. It's not so hard. Those bacteria have digested the material in, and so it's nice. And over years of time, that's where it comes from. Our soil pH is the level of acidity or alkalinity. So whether we're an alkaline, which here in this part of Nebraska, we are definitely an alkaline soil, above 7.0. So we're opposite of an acid. So the pH is fairly buffered, meaning it's not going to move around very much. And it's a little on the slight side. It's a little lower here. And the macronutrients, which are your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, seem to be more stable in the soil as well. Every year, we're going to be adding some type of nitrogen source, because that is the macronutrient of the 3 that dissipates the quickest. Also, when we no-till, it encourages our earthworms to populate and do the tillage for us naturally. So our next picture that I have, this is a really nice example of a no-till garden that was published by North Carolina State Extension. And you can see that wherever they have plantings, you can see their rows, you can see the paper under there. So there's a layer of newspaper, and then they've got their mulch that they're mulching on top of it. And you will see raised beds in the no-till gardens. You will see them flat and then or directly planted in and not hilled up. You will also see a fair amount of drip irrigation. So we're going to talk about drip irrigation as a way to conserve moisture, but also pinpoint, apply your water right to your crop and not allowing anything else to germinate, because you don't want to feed your weeds. Your weeds are your competition and they steal. So that is really important. We also see that we have some buckets where they warmed up the sides where the tomatoes were growing in. You can plant buckets halfway down into the ground, and the warmth off the sides of the bucket will help warm up that spot where you're going to plant those warm loving crops. Our warm loving crops are tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, okra. Those are the warm ones, along with your cucumbers and our melons. So those are the ones that really like the warmth. So we're going to have to do some modifying. In this case, in the picture, they're using the bucket and the heat absorbed and bounced off of that red to help warm that spot up. So that works good. And also, if you look at the front row, there are some marigolds. People will plant marigolds to attract different beneficial insects that will fight other insect pests. So there's some good stuff there as well. It's also a way of diversifying the garden, adding more of what we would call the cottage garden, where we have the herbs and we have the flowers. We can use those to repel insects or pest problems, and they also will attract beneficial insects. So that's some other things that are good in this picture I wanted to show you. So the difference in the end, perception is the, not having that nice clean row necessarily set up. And the garden look is going to be different. You're going to have a lot of mulch layers. You're going to have maybe some newspaper sticking out if you don't get everything covered. It may be look a little more woolly than what we would think in a traditional garden, but that's something that's okay. It's just what we're used to, and wrapping your head around those changes. So how about rabbits? Will they eat the garden dead? One of the things is if you plant plants that have a strong smell like marigold around, they don't like the smell. And that's one thing that you can do. You can also do chicken wire barriers around tender plants in a hoop type of frame, and you wire the chicken wiring or hail screen to a frame and cover your tender plants as they grow. And that is a good way to keep the rabbits out. That term is called a cloche, which is French for bell, meaning it's a bell shape over the plants. Should only black and white newspaper be used? It is preferable to use black and white, just plain newsprint. You do not want to use glossy. And most of our newspapers are going to soy ink, so that is also a benefit. So newspapers are very good. So thank you for asking, because people will ask that. You can lay paper down in sheets, like in this picture from North Carolina State did, or you can buy bags of shredded newsprint. So you can get newsprint in the bag from the local newspapers or recycling places. And I've taken shredded newspaper, and that was part of my base. And I wetted it down so it packed down, and then I put my layers on top of it. So that helped. So perception that we get is that the no-till can look messy. So it's something that you got to kind of get your way around thinking it's okay. No-till plots are multi-year with organic matter and plant material. So we're building up organic matter. We're allowing those microbes and the fungi in the soil to break that material down over time. We're building a healthier seed bed, and one that will receive the seed and allow that seed to germinate and not have a hard pan to deal with. And conventional tillage can stir up weed seeds to germinate. And our number one pest that most everyone will ask me is bindweed. Bindweed seed can sit up to 7 years in the soil without needing to germinate. We run the tiller through, and oh, by the way, we roll it up. Or someone received some manure from a source. A lot of times we'll get it from an old feedlot, and there's weed seed in it, and it'll show up. And then you got to work a little extra to smother it in one way or another to get it controlled. But when we conventional till, we're accidentally bringing weed seeds up to the surface where they can have the chance to germinate and take off. So I've got more comments in here. Black fabric is used and is perfectly fine. And so that worked out great. So you can definitely use black plastic. You can also use weed barrier fabric. The only thing about weed barrier fabric is your drip lines need to be under the weed barrier fabric. So the moisture is going straight to the base of the plant that you're intending to grow, because the weed barrier fabric can inhibit moisture infiltration. So that's one thing to think about. So that is a possibility. The black plastic is 3M Corporation, the maker of sticky notes and Scotch Guard. They now have a biodegradable plastic mulch. And so if you go to a greenhouse supplier website, you might be able to buy it. Next comment is, my newspaper just blew away here in Western Nebraska, though I watered it and put mulch on it. You may have to put some rocks on. You might have to put some weights down. And, and that's part of the life of Western Nebraskans, because the wind blows, it never stops. So we hear that, a lot of that with bark mulch too, and plantings, that the wind just whips it around and carries it away. So we may have to put some extra weight to it, even when we wet it down. And so that's a challenge. Here's another kind of telling picture, is the difference of a plant that has a hard pan. You can see on your right, there is that layer, and that layer is from an implement or a tiller with tines and equipment beating a layer. It's going to go down so far, and it's going to beat. Those tines are pounding away, and then they create a layer that roots do not want to permeate through. You also see on the right side that there's not a lot of organic matter. It's very shallow here with conventional till. So yeah, it may look pretty on top, but take a good sharpshooter spade and go down deeper, and you don't have as much organic matter as you would here on the left. The left is a picture of a no-till garden where over time you're getting a deeper and deeper set of organic matter. And that's really a benefit. And it also allows for that soil to mellow, like we said, break down to those normal chemical processes over time. And the roots have the ability to penetrate and move and are not as stunted. So I thought this was really kind of a telling picture to share with everyone today. So then we have the historical perspective. Our no-till is more like old vegetable gardens, where we're doing that composting and we're putting that matter out, we're layering it, we're using manure. But as people got away from the farm and then have access to those products, and we had more tillage equipment available, especially in the 1930s, where people started getting those little rototiller tractors that look kind of cool. They're very primitive. That was the beginning of that process of clean plots and starting to use pesticides. And now we find out that some of those pesticides, we're really glad that they don't use those anymore on food crops.
David, what about the strawberry patches where you need to till them under the mother plant to get growth of the new strawberry plant?
We have a question on a berry patch, such as strawberries, where you have to do renovation, where you're going to, after the first year or so, you're going to mow between the rows and the berry patch and cut that off and make them do some more growth. So that really is a challenge. So you can fork lightly with a potato fork is really preferable. And you can stir it up and break that up, because that initiates more growth for the plants in the strawberry patch. Got another question.
You need a glass of water.
Yes, I might need a glass of water. Thank you. On cough drop number 2. So there's been a paradigm shift starting in the 1930s where we had more mechanization in the garden at the small scale level. And over time, we had more and more conventional tillage. The 1950s really brought an age of nice straight rows, everything planted in beautiful rows and planted in succession years, what we call continuous cropping, and the use of pesticides, and not thinking about crop rotation, not thinking about adding the manure, not adding the organic matter in, not having a cover crop. We're planting vegetable after vegetable after vegetable, like they're planting corn after corn after corn after corn. And that persisted quite a while until we had water shortages across the country, and especially in the plains for continuous cropping. We also started building resistance to insects, insect control, and weed control. And that needed to change some things. In our current state of situations, we are doing more and more research with resistance to disease because we have overused products as well as insects and insect damage. And so now the pendulum has swung back to start using crop rotations, increasing organic matter, and bringing the cover crops in to help bring some nutrients back into the ground or to reduce erosion. All those things that we used to do years ago are starting to come back. So we think about everything in horticulture, just like everything else, it's a pendulum that swings. And we find out that a lot of the skills that we used to have been lost, that the grand and great grand and great grand did. So that's something to remember. Which leads us to, why are people changing? As that there was a lot of mismanaged ground from continuous cropping. Well, the worst offenders in the vegetable garden is planting tomatoes in the same spot for years because of the buildup of bacteria and diseases from doing that. And then people wonder why that doesn't work. And sometimes you don't have a very large spot to work with. And so they're going to raise your tomatoes because that's your favorite crop. I totally understand that. And just sometimes you may have to bring something else in. And even if it's flipping to another side just for 1 year, it's very valuable to move your crops around. And so that's why we have the handout that I will walk you through once we get through a break about class to do some of those rotations and following those plant families that will help you reduce the disease problems and the insect problems. We also have in our traditional gardens, our conventional gardens, we have really reduced organic matter. And when we get soil test results back where people have almost nothing, we're giving them recommendations. You got to build your soil organic matter back. And you're going to have to add in. And it's changing your soil holding capacity for water and nutrients will make it better. It allows the soil to break down and for roots to move better, especially if we have clay soils where it's just really hard for roots to move. And then if you have a hard pan on top of clay soil, it's kind of like growing in a concrete parking lot. It's really a challenge. And then the next one is dealing with the needs that the weeds that are emerging from our tillage, meaning we're stirring up those weeds on accident. Sometimes, depending on a manure source, we can bring in weeds too. And I've had people say that it's like, yeah, we brought something out of an old cattle lot and now we got weeds galore. And that happens, absolutely happens. And so now I got to think about what we're going to do to it to fix it. And that is no-till and traditional. And then conserving our moisture levels, because if we have a no-till situation, then we are conserving the soil erosion from the wind. which is always going to be a piece here in Nebraska. We're also conserving moisture because every time we open the ground, we're losing moisture. And that's a scarce commodity that we have to take care of. We should never take that for granted. We also need to build up that bacterial population that's present if we're not disturbing it very much. And if we're not using pesticides, then that brings our earthworms to come back. Our earthworm population will start coming back. We will also start to see more beneficials because a lot of our insecticides are what we call a spectricide, meaning it wipes out everything, good, bad, or indifferent. So if we start doing some management that's different and things that bring in the good insects are beneficials and the ones that hunt the bad insects, as well as not using the chemicals that would scare off the earthworms because of the salt content in those products, you'll see a massive difference. Okay. Should I remove the black plastic now, put down organic matter and let it sit until planting time and then put the black plastic on? So we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So you're a great segue towards what we're going to do next. So now we're going to put things into practice. This is our practical application. So the first thing we can do now, this is something you can do now, is we're going to start getting that ground covered. So we want to take the black plastic off in this case, and we're going to start our layers of organic matter that's going to break down. And the first one is going to be a layer of cardboard or shredded newspaper on the bottom, no more than a couple inches deep, especially over your weed-prone areas. And if you need to scalp the weeds down and do some, literally scalping the weeds off, you may need to. If we were at a warmer time of the year, you may have to do some Roundup if it is so bad that you'll never get rid of it. And once we apply Roundup, we need to wait 2 weeks and then we can put material back on. So then we're going to alternate between the brown layers and the green layers. And your brown layer are the carbon sources, sawdust, leaves, corn stalks, pine needles, peat moss, straw and hay, all of those. You can put that on top next. Some people will put some soybean meal, cottonseed, and blood meal next as a fertilizer source, a little bit of a nitrogen, and then put the kitchen scraps on. But kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, composted manure would be the next layer. And then you're going to put another layer of brown on top of that. So you're going to keep layering. So that's really important to do. And this is a good picture to show everyone. This is from another extension publication. This is from Texas A&M about composting. And this is basically, you're going to make a literal compost pile on top of the ground. You're going to make your layers on top and let everything break down in no-till garden versus having a bin and putting it in. So in this case, you see the dry leaves, the corn stalks, the hay. Talks about the kitchen waste, and then that's organic, and then your garden debris on top of that. And you can put manure on. Some people just put, they will put on topsoil. So you don't have to put livestock manure on. You need some soil that is heavier to mash it down and to get it hot. And that'll help break things down. And then you apply the layers again.
David?
Yes.
Can I ask you on the last slide? I guess maybe I missed it. The no more than how many inches deep?
2.
That it was 2 both places.
Yeah, we're going to do this. This is where we're going to go at 2 right now.
If there's no moisture, this won't work. So
You need to add water. Yes, so if you're dry, you need some add some water to activate it. So
Could you talk more about kitchen waste?
kitchen waste, meaning anything that is not meat or dairy. Kitchen wise, it comes out of the refrigerator pretty much that you don't eat. So we don't want to put scraps, meat scraps, bones, milk, cheese. One, it'll attract creatures that you don't want in the garden digging up stuff. And two, it's very hard to digest for that to break down in the composting decomposition process. So that's important. And the green, yes, the kitchen scraps can be moldy because we want those microbes in there. So grass clippings can work just as long as you don't have pesticide on there. So no weed killers. So if you haven't put that on your lawn, that's great. That's the best thing you can do. Big area, and we don't want that much kitchen waste. You can put the grass clippings on. That would work fine, especially if you have large areas. So, and if you have a pretty well maintained, healthy lawn that's dense, you won't need a lot of those pesticides. So that's great. You're not trying to kill weeds if you have a thick stand of grass. So that's good. But you do have to have moisture in here. So you do have to run a little water. I have the phone on just in case there's an emergency. So, but that's not an emergency. I apologize.
How much heavy dirt do you put on top of this stuff?
I would do a couple inches deep because you want it to press. You want it to press down on everything below it. So you have your dry leaves, your kitchen waste, your garden debris. Then you're going to put a couple, 2-3 layers of soil or manure. Dried out manure will be great. And then add on top. So we want that weight to come down again. So if we went clear to the top again with the sawdust, it's just going to repeat itself. So you're going to keep on making layers as you want. But you're going to have to add soil, good topsoil, to help press it down. And it'll break. It really does break. It goes through the thermophilic stage is the highest stage, and that's the one that eats the most. Gets us to about 150 degrees, 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's when things really start breaking down. So that helps.
If you have putting pesticides on your grass,
Mhm.
how far does that reach over into your garden?
Unless you have the question is what happens if you have pesticide put on the lawn and does it go into the yard or does it go into the garden? You really have to watch the wind if it carries over in, but also is there any water that could possibly be carrying it? Is there a slope where irrigation from a lawn sprinkler system may carry it into the garden too? So usually not bad. Biggest thing is making sure if you are applying or someone else is applying, please be mindful that it doesn't drift in or run in to the garden.
If you use weed killer the year before, can you use the grass, fresh grass this year?
If the herbicide was used or the pesticide was used the previous year, the answer is yes. So eggshells are wonderful. Yes, please put those in. Garden debris, preferably we have a lot of rotted produce as time goes on. That, that's fine. If you have pumpkins, you need to probably break them up or let them break down, or a watermelon or things like that, because we've done that. Take a hoe to it and break it up, and then it'll break itself down. So works pretty good.
You have to worry about the E. coli if your manure is too fresh.
Yes, the questions about the E. coli is that we want manure that has preferably been weathered for 1 year. Let it break down for a year. So there's usually a manure pile somewhere where it's old and it's dried up. That's the stuff you bring in.
And what about chicken manure?
Chicken manure is high in ammonia, and so it needs to air out and dissipate. And so what I do is I put my chicken litter out in a pile. from my chicken house and I let it weather over to the winter and then I can apply it the next spring. Yeah, so that works out pretty good. So I'm getting another use of this, so that works out great. So I paid for the chicken litter once and now I'm getting the bang for the buck. So kitchen waste can have vegetable seeds, that's fine, because as you're adding on top of it, you're smothering a lot of those seeds out. So, and a lot of the vegetables and fruit that we have do not germinate true from what they are now. So that's okay. And you may get some, may get some volunteer cherry tomato plants or a volunteer zucchini or something like that. That happens, but that's not bad. So that will be interesting. Okay, we planted elephant mushrooms on one side of the garden this fall. Should I protect that and not pile the organic matter? I probably would. Elephant garlic, I wouldn't layer it yet. I just leave that, I would not layer on top of it. So garlic, let the garlic grow and just be mindful. Can this layering be done on top of grass in order to make more garden space? Yes, you can if it's a thin stand. If it is a thick stand, you probably do need to kill that or cut that sod out and then start. So, because if you put it literally on grass without doing something to get rid of the sod, it's going to take the process even longer to go. So depends on how much time you want to spend doing this, but it's best to probably cut out the sod, or you can put Roundup on it and kill it and then take the sod out. Either way. Okay, so our next one is the time factor, because time is always a factor that you need to be thinking ahead and getting this done, because we will need that help. And that's why we talked about the water, supplemental water may be needed in areas to help break down those first layers. So we need some moisture in the product, and hopefully the stuff you're adding on has some moisture. If it doesn't, if it's all dry as a bone, you need to add some water to it somehow. And that'll help kind of kickstart things. And exposure to the environment. We need the extremes here in Western Nebraska to do its job. So those hot days here that we hit, we hit 70 degrees on a couple random days, and then massive cold the next. That is a breaking and weathering process that's very good for this. So we will have the heat, we'll have the cold, we'll have the wind, we'll have snow. Who knows? It'll help break it all down, and that's exactly what we need to break down those layers to the point where they're not recognizable anymore. So you're just making that more organic matter build in. And breaking down layers increases your organic matter, because you have just organic matter at the end. You won't be able to discern what's in there anymore. It's all going to look like coffee grinds. It's going to look like good coffee grinds. And it'll be very good for good soil to seed contact to plant in your garden or your transplants.
Have it all broken down by May, and you want to plant?
It should break down pretty quick.
Should we be watering now?
Yes.
Get started.
If you get started, you need to be watering this and letting it break down and rot. And that may be filling up a big, depending on the area, it may be filling up the sprinkler canning and running the sprinkler can over it on the dry times and just letting it kickstart. Now, if we get some snows and it melts, Mother Nature helps us out. So that's good. And then we got our earthworm friends, and they do the tillage work. They do the tillage work that the tiller doesn't do anymore. And they will populate back once we stop tilling, and they will populate back when we stop using pesticides that have the salts in them that drive earthworms away. So if you can imagine dropping table salt on an earthworm, can you imagine what they're going to do? Help dry up. So those salts that are in a lot of those pesticides are going to drive them away because they desiccate the earthworm. Different earthworm species live at different levels. You will hear about a species called a little red wiggler, and you'll see them in gardening catalogs and on websites. Those are the little red worms. They are very shallow dwellers. They are the shallow dwellers in the first 3 inches of soil or so. And so they're helping work that organic matter right under the soil level. Our earthworms are night crawlers, the big guys, the fishing gang goes after, are deep dwellers. And they will travel deep and they will come up to the soil surface. And I'll show you the diagram here in just a minute. And they will do the deep digging while our shallow dwellers are doing the stuff right under the soil surface.
Have any of the invasive species worms arrived in Nebraska at all?
I don't know question is if we've had any invasive species of earthworms that have arrived in Nebraska. I don't know that question, but that would be a good one to look up and do some research on. And hopefully I can get you a list of the different species and share with everyone so you can see what the species are that we have.
You said put cardboard in the brown,
Cardboard's under the brown,
under the brown.
under the brown. Mhm. This is a publication from Purdue University Extension in Indiana. And this is a great example of our shallow dwellers, the little red wigglers, moving and digesting. And so they're shallow. And when they eat, they're going to eat organic matter and they're going to come up to the soil surface and they're going to, and when they spit it out, it's what we call a middling. Those are you walk on your yard that are absolutely annoying. And so we do have that potential as a chance, as a problem here. If you have your, someone is unmuted by accident, if you would please mute your microphones. So get everyone muted here. So we can hear your feedback in your back of your room, please. I want to make sure everyone's muted. Okay, so our picture here also shows the subsoil where our deep dwellers, such as our night crawlers, they're going to go deeper into the ground and they're going to make a deeper run. So when you look at your night crawlers, they make the big holes and they're going to go deep and they're not going to show up in the shallow areas of an earthworm farm or a garden bed unless they're there to regurgitate or there is a massive amount of moisture in the soil that drives them to come up to the soil surface naturally. But as they do this activity, moving all around, if you've ever seen an earthworm farm grown in an aquarium, you will see everywhere they go, crisscrossing everywhere, which is pretty amazing to me. So I love seeing that. But one way to show the earthworms, the deep dwellers to the school kids, we had to put black plastic on the side of the aquarium because the night crawlers would not come up to the edge because they did not like the light. So we had to put black plastic on the side of the aquarium and then turn the lights off in the classroom and make it dim and then pull up the sides. And then they would come up and they would burrow close. So, but this is what the earthworms are doing. These are the two popular species that we talk about in gardening. And this is what they're doing. They're breaking things up and then they're coming up and they're spitting out the leftovers. And these are the mounds that people complain about when they walk in their yard and, you know, it gets wonk, wonk, you know, and like, I hate that when the earthworms come up. And actually that's a sign of a healthy environment that you haven't pumped it full of chemicals. for those who are very sustainable. And unless there is a real need for you to get rid of those, get rid of the earthworms because you're unsteady under your feet, it's best to just let them do their job. You can also take a rake and you can run a rake through the garden plot or in your yard and break those middlings up. But this is another publication that you can take your cursor and you can highlight and do a Google search on. It'll come right up for you. So let's think about garden planting. So you can directly seed right into that new built seed bed. Absolutely perfect. The plant roots will break that soil loose. It's loosened because of that process. And as your roots keep on working and growing and developing, they'll break it down even further. So it helps increase that soil tilt. And the root crops help break up tight soils and hard pan layers. And I have a case in point. We have a high tunnel greenhouse in North Platte, the research farm, that we did have a hard pan in. And you know what we did to fix it? We planted turnip seeds in the off season and turned the water on and let the turnips grow. And the turnip seed is very inexpensive. And we literally let that turnip population grow and explode, and it broke that heavy soil up for us. So that's one way to get through it. Onions are another great crop, carrots, parsnips. Even if you don't even eat the parsnips, you can raise them for that. Or the turnips, you can raise the turnips for that, just to break the soil up. It's a cheap enough seed. You'll hear about what they call tillage radishes, where the radishes are a daikon type Japanese radish that gets very large, and you can let them grow and they will break up a heavy soil as well. And then you can rotate your crop by plant family to help avoid some of those diseases and replenish the nitrogen. And that's with primarily your beans and your peas. That's in the plant family Fabaceae. And that's in your handout that we'll talk about once we get out of this presentation, but does a great job of adding nitrogen back into the soil. Very important for us. Okay, got some more questions in the chat. Pine needles are great. Absolutely. To add as a mulch into the layers for no-till gardening. You can layer pine needles, so perfectly fine. Now, don't steal the pine needles from under your pine tree because your pine tree needs them. And this is something we will talk about in landscape management. Your evergreens cast their needles and produce a weed barrier fabric on their own. So volunteer trees and weeds don't grow under them. So it's killing off its competition. So while pine needles are very good for the vegetable garden, please do not steal all of them from under your evergreens because they are doing a job for the evergreens as well. So.
Like the pine litter that's used for cat litter and the horse, it's called horse. It's like feline pine.
There are byproducts that are used for bedding and for litter. That is pine, and that is an acceptable product as well. You could scatter in, they're rolled in pellets. So,
Like $6 for a 40-pound bag.
so for
Just pine.
pine shavings, but it's rolled pine product. It's rolled. It's kind of fun looking.
They come in a fine or a coarser one. I like the fine one.
And the fine breaks down faster too, so that's a good thing. So. Yes, the cardboard is a huge help, and it breaks down everything really well. Pine needles are considered a brown because that's dead. Those are fallen needles. They're no longer live. So here is an example. I've got a picture here of This is a 4-year rotation of vegetables. This is from Fairfax County, Virginia, their master gardeners, which would be the DC suburbs in Northern Virginia. And it shows you planting by family and moving those families around. So that works good. If you want, you can copy this webpage and go straight to their webpage and look at it. But you'll see how the squares move around. You're moving in a clockwise manner. So whether you have a first year, second year, third year, fourth year, you can see how they moved them around. It works pretty good. The biggest thing is to keep those tomatoes and peppers, eggplant all together. Potatoes are also in that family. So that's the biggest offender of all of them, disease-wise. The cole crops, which would be kale, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, tends to bring in a lot of pesky insects. So they bring in insects, and the tomatoes, the peppers, and the potatoes, and the eggplant bring in soil-borne problems. So that's why you see in this first year rotation, you have the tomatoes, that family, and the cole crops on a diagonal, and you got something buffering them. So that's why you buffer between those two popular families, because one is an insect magnet and the other one is a soil-borne problem magnet. So that's why I like sharing this screen with you.
How big a plot is that?
What's that?
How big is that plot?
And we asked how big that plot is. You could have a couple cucumber plants in that square. And this shows 2 tomato plants and then a patch of beans and a patch of the kale and broccoli. So it doesn't have to be big. You just expand it out. So you're just making sure you're doing the groupings. So yeah, you could have a small garden with a tomato plant and some beans, and then maybe some broccoli plants, your kale for your smoothie in one section, and then a couple cucumbers, and that's it. So rotate those around. Okay, encouraging the beneficial insects. We have a lot of pollinators that are beneficials, and they are great to put on the margins of the garden space. And these are a lot of our native wildflowers and plants that attract butterflies and insects, moths. And I can send the Neb guide that has a list of those. A lot of people plant marigolds, like we said, for the scent, for them to be strong. And the oil is what drives people, not so much people, but other insects and pests away, because they don't like to smell that strong smell off of the marigold. Consider planting an annual herb species that can be planted and rotated near each vegetable crop. And this goes back to more of that old kitchen cottage garden where you had to raise your own herbs. So, and these are your annuals. Avoid and herb species that are invasive. The big one is mint. Oh, heaven forbid. If you plant mint, you'll have mint everywhere. So don't plant mint in a vegetable garden and expect it to rotate it every year. So that one's a bad one. So mint needs to,
Cover the whole garden.
it'll take over your whole garden. So that one's best in a big tub or a patch that you can control. And the reason why we do that is we cut off the beneficial plants and herbs at the soil level at the fall. We want to leave their roots in the ground to rot. And that rotting helps increase more organic matter, more fungi, more bacteria working and breaking down and mellowing that soil out. And we also do this with vegetable crops. So when we're done with the cabbage, we whack that cabbage off, we leave that stem in the ground and we let it rot.
You want to leave some on top for the bugs though.
You can. You can leave a few of the leaves left. So your outer leaves and the cabbage, you can leave that. That'll rot down and work great too. So that will work.
So parsley would be in that group. I don't know, will parsley come back
Parsley can reseed itself, and you can let it die out. I've let sage die out. It'll come back, and if it comes back again, all I have to do is just cut it off and it'll start itself out. Dill is one that if you start, it'll reseed itself over and over and over and over again. So you may be doing a little extra pulling. But here's a good set of pictures of insects, and it's not by any means the entire grouping, but this is from North Carolina State Extension. Our lacewings, our praying mantis, our arachnids, ladybugs, which are in the Asian lady beetle groupings, ground beetles, different types of bee species. We also have like the flower fly, which is actually a fly that's mimicked itself as a bee, which is kind of cool that's in there. So the soldiers, the spine soldier bug. We also have what we call the wheel bug. If you look on the back of the wheel bug, it looks like a pointy wheel. That's also known as an assassin bug. We also have the minute pirate bug that has a black and white hourglass shaped pattern on the back. They're quite good. We do have some neb guides I can send to you. They need to be updated, but you'll see why they're still good. I can send that out with our groupings of materials with the description of our common beneficials, our good insects that are feeding and doing that. So these guys are going after the bad insects, and if a bad insect population shows up, and you shouldn't be surprised if there's a whole bunch of Asian lady beetles that show up behind it because they're out feeding. Okay, so next dog question in the room.
The little ones that roll up in a ball, are they're not on it.
The roly-polies?
Yeah,
The roly-polies are good because they are decomposers. And this wasn't an exhaustive list by any means, but the roly-polies are also good. They're also called a sow bug.
oh, yeah.
We call them sow bugs, if you've ever heard of sow bugs. And they'll roll up, and they are good decomposers. So we want them in there too. We don't want to kill them, even though the kids think it's fun. Aren't there differences, different species? Some of the Asian lady beetles are kind of pests, but for the most part, for what we're using them for, in this case with vegetables, they're perfectly fine. Is everyone doing okay? Do we need a break or keep going? Keep going.
Need a break.
Need a break. Okay. Would 10 minutes be okay? We have covered a lot of material.
Well, 10 minutes be fine.
10 minutes. So I'm going to stop the recording and we will break for 10 minutes, get to the bathroom, go refill our coffee, and we'll be back in 10. How about that?
Good.